Returning to the Mont Ventoux Gran Fondo, I was ready to fight to retain my title against a much stronger field than last year. After an early crash, however, a complicated feed station and nearly 25 kilometers of chasing for the final 20-kilometer climb to the top of Ventoux, would I even have any energy left to put up a fight? You couldn't write this script. This is my Ventoux race video. Sit back, relax, like, subscribe, and enjoy. Now in this year's edition of the Mont Ventoux Gran Fondo, I was in the 135 kilometer race that took in 2 major climbs. Now of the 3 routes at this Gran Fondo, I was doing the longest one, 135 kilometers with 3,200 meters of elevation gain, finishing on top of Mont Ventoux, climbing the Bedouin side, which is of course the most famous side, the one that's linked to the Tour de France. Now this route actually only had 2 significant climbs, the Col de Haumont and the Mont Ventoux at the end. Now the first climb came around mid-distance, just over 13 kilometers and an average gradient of 5%. And do I even need to tell you the Mont Ventoux statistics? Tops out at 1900 meters and is around 20 kilometers at 8% average. Now there's a quick course overview. Now equipment wise, I was riding my Factor O2 VAM, my lightweight climbing bike. I was running my 28 32mm black ink race wheels coupled with Continental GP5000 TT tires set up with Tubolito inner tube. Those tires measured in at 28mm. The gearing for this was a 52-36 with an 1130 cassette. Now to actually film this epic, I used the Insta360 Go 3S camera. The really tiny, about 40 gram action camera that was mounted under my handlebars. Now in last year's video, I had 290 comments. I want to try and beat that this year. And I thought, leave a comment down below that best describes, using emojis, my emotions as I was climbing Mont Ventoux. Speaking of comments, a lot of you said on last year's video that it was really complicated and confusing that nearly everybody on all different routes was wearing the same event jersey. And so it was really hard to distinguish who was in your race and who wasn't. That didn't change this year. We were all still in the same jerseys. However, I was still wearing my Rule 28 Aero socks and my Rule 28 bib shorts. And of course I went for my Casque Vallegro helmet for extra breathability. So let's get into the race then. It all started with me being on the front row. I was granted that starting position because I was last year's winner. So I was able to line up right in the front of the start line in front of almost 5,000 other riders taking on this event. Now it's actually pretty cool that I got to start at the front because I was with the lead car. So it very much brought back memories of me being in a real proper bike race again. So as you can imagine, the first couple of kilometers are fairly hectic. People are trying to get from the back to the front, trying to maintain position, just generally trying to be in a safer position all around to avoid any crashes. So you could actually feel the tension building. Everybody's just trying to jostle and find their feet in a fast moving peloton. The roads are as wide as they are. Sometimes it makes it more dangerous than when they're narrow. There was this one fast straight section, a descent, and I was sitting around maybe 80th, 60th position. Is really hard to tell when the bunch is that deep, but I could definitely see the front. And we hit this one section of road where there was some kind of traffic island, or the road narrowed, and there was a big slam on the brakes in front of me. And I had a little bit of time to think about what I was going to do, but I did actually start braking quite early. But because we were moving at nearly 60 kilometers an hour, I just did not have a chance to stop. I was a little bit late to the party, but I did join the crash. Now sadly, the YouTuber in me is kicking myself that I wasn't actually filming at this point. So in order to prove that I crashed, here's a little clip of my little bloodied finger on the camera while I was riding along, because I thought no one's going to believe me I crashed. I need to give some kind of proof. I've been in far worse crashes. Thankfully, the bike was okay. I was just a little bit scraped and bumped. One thing I learned being a pro was you never panic when you crash. You give your bike a little once over, you put your chain back on, you straighten your levers, and then you give yourself a quick look over and you get going. So it always reminds me of a big crash I had at the Tour de Beauce in Canada in 2018. If any of you have been watching this channel since then, you will remember that video even, where I basically looked like I'd been taken to a cheese grater. Anyway, I managed to get back to the front group. At this point, the roads are quite wide and fast, so I didn't have to exert much effort to get back to the front. Thankfully, the race wasn't really on at this point. It was then time to think about the first real climb of the day, the Col de Haut, which in English translates roughly to the dead man's climb. A little bit strange, I know. As part of going out there with a private tour operator in Alp Cycles, I was going to have my own personal feed station on this climb, which makes sense because we're about halfway into the event and temperatures are going to be quite high today. They're going to be maxing out close to 30 degrees, but because of where we're going to be at that point, hopefully on the top of Ventoux, the temperature might not read as high, but it will feel high because there wasn't any wind, and this moonscape of Mont Ventoux has the effect of making it feel a lot hotter than it is. I'm sure you've heard the stories of pros on the mountain, and you've only got to look at the decimation that it causes when people are coming up there on very tired legs and very dehydrated. So I felt like it was important to stay on top of my hydration and nutrition in this year's event, particularly because of the heat. So because of that, I was consuming a minimum of 500 milliliters of liquid an hour, and within that I was having around 90 grams of carbs per bottle. I would then take on 50 gram gel, all from Sturka, my nutrition partner, and I would stay on course for that nutrition strategy until I got to the bottom of Ventoux, where I would have another private feed so that I can just focus on carrying that one bottle, that one source of energy up that mountain. So we hit the Haut climb and the temperature was slowly creeping up. I realized that this was going to be the first significant part of the race. Riders at the front, which is where I now thankfully found myself, were really pushing the pace at the bottom of the climb. But when we got to the middle section of the climb, it eased off. But not long after that, getting close to the top, it would speed up again. And I see this as quite a common thing in Gran Fondo races. Now thankfully I was able to maintain position right near the front, and knowing that my feed was going to be at the top of this climb, I wanted to position myself at the back of the group so that I could make myself obvious in a sea of people wearing all the same jerseys, so that I could grab my fresh bidon as we were going over the top. We'd be doing a moving feed, not hopefully me having to stop to grab a bottle. Now just a quick one, if you're enjoying this video so far, then please hit the like button and, well, subscribe if you're new here too. So the climb of the Haut we did in 33 minutes and 35 seconds. It's a 14-kilometer climb and our normalized power was just under 300 watts. Now, as you'd expect from a climb this shallow, our VAM is around about the 1100 mark. Now, coming to the top of the Haut, I positioned myself to the back of the group. I could see the feed station coming up at the top, and I was getting ready to get my bottle. I had my other bottle in my mouth, ready to throw it, and then I would grab the other one and put it straight into my empty bottle cage. Now this bottle would be quite important because of the heat, but also because we'd have approximately an hour down to the foot of Mont Ventoux, and I would need to consume certainly at least 750 mils of liquid from the top of here until there. Because don't forget, you're always fueling and hydrating for what's to come. It's never about what's happening right now, it's about what's happening in 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes from now. So as we got close to the top, I could see my bottle was being held out, ready for me to grab. And as we came up, you can't actually see it on the video, but someone, I think, goes to grab my bottle. Now in this situation, I can't comment whether or not someone deliberately went to grab the bottle or was trying to take a bottle from the next person who was feeding on the side of the road and accidentally swiped the bottle and therefore knocked it onto the floor. But all I know is my bottle was now on the floor, and I had to actually stop to pick it up and then get going again. And in the moment, I was so angry. I was so angry that this had happened because it couldn't have happened at a worse point. You see, from the top of the Mont, we had 1 hour, maybe just over an hour, of quite fast road. And not only was this water bottle crucial, but I would also need to stay with the group, because this was the part of the course where you're going to get the most benefit from staying in a group, given that the speeds are so high. So by stopping, I got dropped, but I hadn't got any more water with me. I drank, I'd fueled appropriately up until that point, ready to receive another package of nutrition so that I could keep going and maintain my schedule. I instinctively stopped. I didn't even think about staying with the group and risking it, because I just thought, this is the game plan, and the problem with going off the game plan in the heat and with Ventoux at the end, I might be risking too much, and I might not have anything left for the mountain at the end. So by stopping, I found myself in a small group, and I stayed with them on the descent, and we could see for ages the group in front of us. And the group still was a considerably large size. It must have been at least 60, 70, maybe even 80 riders. The whole Mont climb, was long, 30 minutes, but it wasn't particularly hard. People still made it over the climb. It was quite early into the event, and we didn't really race up it. And up until then, a breakaway hadn't really formed either, because although the course was slightly uphill, there wasn't really any challenging moments. And with now the majority of the course being downhill to the bottom of Ventoux, I don't think people were really thinking too much about a breakaway at this point. They were more thinking about conserving until the mountain. However, while I was chasing to get back on and slightly frustrated by our progress, because at one point we were quite close, and then at another point we dropped and lost a couple of seconds, a breakaway had actually gone clear. Now where it had gone, I have no idea. I don't know where they attacked, where they made their move, I'm not sure. But by the time I got back to the main peloton, I could definitely see, once I got to the front, that potentially the big names that I knew were there, including last year's runner-up, was not in the group. And I knew for sure they were off the front. Now this section of chasing, for me and my small group, was around about 30 minutes at 240 watts normalized, which isn't a lot, but I am highly certain that if I was sat in the peloton, given our average speed was close to 50 kilometers an hour, I think I could have been doing at least 50 watts less than what I was doing in that small group. Now we're about to get to a pretty iconic part of the course, the Gorge de Nesque, which we actually ascended last year, but we were going down this year. It was quite technical. There was big drops either side on the descent, but the big group was happy to stay together and just cruise down it. So I wasn't going to actually help the chase. I made that decision pretty early on when I got back to the group, that I needed to prioritize fueling now and prepare myself for the mountain, because just like last year, the breakaway had gone and I wasn't in it, but I managed to ride the breakaway back in and finish first. However, this year I knew that with the breakaway gone and potentially it being full of all of the favourites, that I was now in a position where I would have to be on the back foot, but even more significantly once we got to the bottom of the mountain. Now I wasn't going to give chase because the terrain just didn't lend itself to it. It was far too fast to be actually eating into the breakaway's advantage. We've seen it in professional races where if there's a tailwind or if there's a downhill run to the finish, it's very, very hard to bring a breakaway back. And when we eventually got to the bottom of Mont Ventoux, I did the same thing I did last year. I attacked as soon as the road went uphill. But I wanted to attack early because I knew last year that if I didn't, I would never have caught first place or second place towards the top of the climb. So we had to try and eat into the advantage as quickly as possible. So that's what I did. Now, into the bottom of Ventoux, I picked up my second feed of the day with AD, and we did a fantastically smooth bottle handoff on the corner, and that was it. I was locked in. So what's really hard to summarize now is this final section of the race, the actual mountain. Now, we didn't by any means hit this climb fresh. We'd done about 2,500 kilojoules of work, which isn't a lot, but it's also not nothing. Now, the peloton was still quite big at the bottom of Ventoux. It was probably around 50, 60 riders. That's a lot more than it was last year. The level of competition is certainly higher this year at the event than it was last year. There's more strength in depth, and that was obvious because of the size of the group coming to the bottom. So when I started the first couple of kilometers of Mont Ventoux, I was in a similar position to I was last year. I was around about 8th or 9th place on the road. The breakaway was up the road with approximately 2 minutes of an advantage. Now, I didn't really know this. I knew they were a fair way ahead probably, but thankfully they did start to split up as soon as they hit the climb. So what happened over the course of maybe the next 10 kilometers until Chalet Reynard, the average is about 9 to 9.5% for a long period of time. However, after that, the gradient tends to shallow off slightly, and you also get the wind coming into play. So the last part from Chalet Reynard to the top is usually my strength. So I got a couple of kilometers into the climb, but I was caught by one rider who just seemed to teleport, to use the Lantern Rouge language, across to me and then just went straight past. Now, I had no chance of getting on this rider's wheel, and there is really no draft, so I let this rider go and stayed at my own pace. Then about 5 riders came across and joined me. They also just went straight past, but 3 of the 5 couldn't keep the pace of the 2 that managed to just keep riding away from us. So we let those 2 go, and then the rest of us just kind of spread out on the climb. We splintered into individuals essentially. Now, as I said, the leading group must have started to fracture on the climb really early. Now, the Bedouin side has lots of straight sections, and I was able to keep a lot of the riders in front of me in my field of view, and this really helped keep me motivated. So when we started to get closer to Chalet Reynard, I noticed that I not only was catching 1 or 2 riders, but there was a cluster of riders not that far in front, about 4 in total. Now, I managed to just put a little surge in just before Chalet Reynard to get onto the back of this group to just give myself a tiny bit of rest as we went round the really, really long hairpin at Chalet Reynard. And what I also noticed was that there were a lot of riders who were really backing off on the shallower sections, but were holding their own when the gradient got steeper again. Now, I'm somebody who can keep my effort and power quite even when the gradient changes back and forth. And this is where the Chalet Reynard section to the top suits me down to the ground. So I caught these 4 riders and I went around them. I started to set pace because I thought if I've caught them and I'm doing about 320 watts, then I should keep going at that pace and hopefully be on my own. But that was easier said than done, because the rider that finished second last year was one of the riders that was holding onto my wheel, and it took me a long time to shake off, but I did push myself a little bit over the limit to do so. Thankfully, I then had enough of a gap to maintain all the way to the finish. I didn't know what position I'd come, of course, because we were still catching riders who were on the shorter course that had come up the Sol side, so I didn't know exactly where I'd finished. However, afterwards, I found out that I'd finished 5th, which, now I come to think of it, I'm pretty proud of. Crashing, the heat, bottle gate. My performance on the day actually gives me a lot of confidence, because when I compare it to last year's, it's very similar, but the temperatures are much higher, maybe 10 degrees more, in fact. When I won it last year, the conditions definitely suited me a lot more. And I was able to do about 6 watts more for the 1 hour climb after about 500 kilojoules more than last year's event as well. So I was in a slightly more fatigued state, able to produce slightly more power for the 1 hour climb. Looking at the data from Mont Ventoux, I did hit it quite hard. The first 5 minutes at 376 watts normalized power before settling in to hit around 324 watts for just over an hour, which is also just under 1400 VAM. 5th place in an arguably better, more deeper competitive field. I'm pretty happy with the way the race went. even if I was a little bit banged up. If you enjoyed this, hang around for the next video, which is going to be a recon ride of the Étape de Tour de France route, coming soon. So make sure you subscribe. Like I said, like the video, leave a comment down below of the emojis, of the emotions you thought I was going through for this whole 1 hour ascent in the heat, and I will see you in that next video. Thanks for watching.